Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Evangelist, and I'd like to welcome you to This Week in FCPA, Episode 56 for the week ending June 9, 2017, the Who's on First edition. This week, Jay and I have a wide-ranging discussion on some of the week's top compliance-related stories. We discuss the Kokesh case at the U.S. Supreme Court, which is significant for SEC enforcement of the FCPA around the penalty of profit disgorgement. Jay talks about Trevor McFadden's decision to leave the Department of Justice for the federal bench. We also hit on Hui Chen's contract not being renewed, but her position is open for job applicants, and we link to the position linkage in the show notes. Also, Andrew Weismann is leaving as the head of the fraud section to go to the Special Prosecutor staff. Talk about former PetroTiger General Counsel Gregory Weissmann, who is banned from SEC practice. Weismann was previously disbarred in 2 states, Pennsylvania and New York. We discuss Matt Stephenson's consideration of what a Wal-Mart settlement might look like. We talk about, again, the federal judge who sentenced Samuel Mebiame, the bagman for Och-Ziff, to prison, and his discussion and questioning of prosecutors about why no individuals from Och-Ziff were prosecuted. Jay previews his weekend report, which I think you will find extraordinarily interesting. He had a lot of great feedback and comments from his prior weekend report on compliance as a business advantage, so he takes another look at it. Also, I continue to talk about the release of my new book, 2016, The Year in Corporate FCPA Enforcement, the only book that takes a look at the most significant year in FCPA enforcement ever. So I link to the purchase location on the show notes as well. This is Tom Fox. Thank you very much for listening to This Week in FCPA. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, the Compliance Evangelist, welcoming you to a special weekend edition of This Week in FCPA for the week ending June 9th, 2017, the Who's on First edition. As always, I'm joined by my cohort and co-host, Jay Rosens, Mr. Monitors. Jay, welcome.
Thanks, Tom. It's kind of fun to actually be talking to you on a languid Saturday afternoon. It's a nice day. We don't have any breaking news, and we had to change the name of the podcast, but I think we're going to be okay moving forward.
I agree. So for those of you who are wondering about my fearless faux prediction, it's now faux one. So I'm still behind the Warriors, but I watched the game, of course, last night, and I saw the greatest first 1 quarter of basketball in the first quarter I think I've ever seen in my life. So kudos to the Cavaliers. They brought the AAA game that LeBron James talked about and scored 49 points in a quarter, which is pretty amazing. So Jay, also not amazing, but equally in the AAA category, we had a case from the U.S. Supreme Court, which really affects FCPA enforcement from the Securities and Exchange Commission. And that, of course, was the Kokesh decision. This case really revolved around the issue of whether or not profit disgorgements are properly classified as a penalty or if they were something else. And the reason that was important is if they were a penalty, then the 5-year statute of limitations comes into play. And what that means is that any conduct more than 5 years before the claim is made cannot be counted against the company for profit disgorgement. I took a look at this really from the angle of lessons to be learned, obviously. And I looked at our great resource, the FCPA blog, who keeps a top 10 of profit disgorgement awards. And they are really stunning. Embedded within FCPA, overall fines and penalties in the top 10 were from $350 million of Siemens to 98 from Technip. So this is not chicken feed we're talking about here. And what this means is that if companies had FCPA violative conduct more than 5 years out, it cannot be counted against them. They cannot be prosecuted for it. under the Securities and Exchange Act of 1934, and they can't be penalized either in the form of direct penalty or be required to give up ill-gotten gain because it's no longer ill-gotten. It's outside the statute of limitations period. So a very interesting decision by the U.S. Supreme Court. I think the commentators, the commentariat of profit disgorgement wisdom, most notably Mark Bone at Miller and Chevalier, were not surprised by this decision. Nevertheless, it's the first time the Supreme Court has specifically answered this question. There had been a circuit split, and indeed even the U.S. Internal Revenue Service had to weigh in on this for tax deduction reasons. So lots of interest in the case. It's not clear how this will affect companies' ability to deduct profit disgorgements from their tax returns. So there may be some interesting developments there. And Mark Bone, who I had earlier this week on a podcast, really raised the, I thought, very interesting issue of what this will do to the decision to self-disclose. Meaning if your conduct was 4.5 years ago, companies may decide to just simply hunker down, remediate, and not self-disclose, and wait till after the 5-year statute of limitations is run, in the hope that not only will they not be caught, but even if they are caught, the conduct won't get them in trouble, or the penalty will be significantly less. Really, I would say the difficulty with that is one, on the decision to self-disclose goes directly contrary to the Yates Memorandum and the FCPA pilot program, number one. And number two is when you look at profits, it's typically not at one fixed point in time in a corporation. So that if you and I reached an agreement on a contract, we might sign that contract today. But if you're delivering a service to me as a shoe store owner, as a record store owner, as a monitor, or as a translator, those services might be delivered in the future, and my payment would be at some point past that. So it's not clear to me, even if a legal action was taken, the results of that action might be somewhere down the road, so that you could still have a profit disgorgement because the actual payment or the profits made would be more than within the 5-year statute. Nevertheless, very significant case, lots of commentary on it. I wrote about it. Really the best legal analysis I saw was from a lawyer named Saskia Zandia, who's also at Miller Chevalier. And once again, Mark Bone, in addition to my podcast, he wrote about it in the FCPA blog. So we'll have all of that in the show notes for our listeners. And I would encourage everyone to not only read the show note information that I'm going to put forward, but also the decision itself is only 14 pages. So it's quite short. And probably should also note it was a 9-0 decision. In this rarefied world, we rarely get as strong a message as that from the U.S. Supreme Court. So anything kind of from your angle on this, or how it might fit into what you guys do as Mr. Monitors?
I don't think that there's anything from our perspective, because we are going to be brought in after some type of resolution has been reached. But I just wanted to echo, that 9-0 decision by SCOTUS. And it just seems that the way things are in the country right now, to have that complete agreement across ideological grounds that this is the way disgorgements should be treated going forward, I think, like you said, it's going to really factor into individual companies' calculus. And whereas in the past, I think the FCPA pilot program had encouraged companies to waive statute of limitations to get in and to be considered for leniency. To your point earlier, if you're at the 4.5-year mark, you've got to decide, do you come forward, or do you roll the dice for the next 180 days? So there should be lots of interesting fallout from this matter.
So next up, we had a really interesting article by our good friend and colleague, Matt Kelly. And Matt wrote about the decision that, or the announcement that Trevor McFadden is going to leave the Department of Justice for the federal bench. He's going to become a judge. So obviously, listeners of this blog are well aware, or podcast, I should say, and readers of my blog are well aware of Trevor McFadden. He made some extraordinarily strong remarks about FCPA enforcement and compliance programs in March and April that we've extensively reported and talked about. But Matt really talked about, in terms of several key folks around FCPA are leaving the Department of Justice. Andrew Weismann, the head of the fraud section, which the FCPA unit is under or within, is leaving to go to the Special Prosecutor staff. And of course, we had the announcement this week that Hui Chen's contract will not be renewed. So, Jay, I've not had the chance to ask you publicly if you're going to apply for the job. But if you are, I've linked to the application portal on our show notes. So I'm sure that they would definitely take someone with your qualifications and take a very, very strong look at your candidacy. So really very interesting kind of who's on first or who's going to be on first. We should, following up on your last point about the current political climate, just because you're nominated for a federal bench doesn't mean you're going to get it, number one. And number two, it means the Senate has to confirm you. And at this point, we haven't seen the Senate do anything except confirm Neil Gorsuch for the Supreme Court. So whether or not the Senate gets to this appointment during 2018 or 17, rather, is an open question. All appointments expire at the end of the term. So, but I don't know if it's a sinking ship that people are leaving or it's logical. Do you have this kind of turnover? McFadden had only been there, obviously, since the new administration came in January. But any kind of thoughts on where that might be taking us?
Well, I think how I read Matt's article was, and I don't want to butcher the gentleman's name, but do you know how to say the name of Brian and the gentleman who's coming in from Kirkland and Ellis? And I think, what would you say, Benkowski? Is that how you'd say it?
Maybe.
So anyhow, the way I read it is that he's coming in as Mr. McFadden's boss. And so it looks like Mr. McFadden wanted to jump ship and was able to get nominated for that vacant judge position in Virginia. So I think that, talking about the politics there, some people do not see that this is a long-term position to be in at the DOJ, and with lots of pressures to lawyer up and worrying about whether or not there is the proper tone at the top, as Hui Chen seemed to indicate. I think that there's it's a very interesting time at DOJ, and you and I were talking offline before we got on this call that there's a certain inertia there. And if you have prosecutors who are fired and you don't have people taking their place, it's pretty hard to move forward on cases and resolutions. So it's almost seems to be that things might be just grinding to a halt by somewhat by neglect and some not by the Senate having more pressing engagements on their mind.
So let's leave a little time at the end to talk about Hui Chen and maybe move to some other topics that came up this week. Our friends Gregory, Weismann, and PetroTiger were in the news yet again. And frankly, other than PetroTiger getting a declination, I can't think of any news around this whole matter, sordid matter that was good. But the Securities and Exchange Commission banned former PetroTiger General Counsel Gregory Weissman from practicing before it for 2 years. Weismann had previously been disbarred in 2 states. That's pretty impressive. In New York in 2014 and Pennsylvania in 2015. And Weismann, I'm not sure we really, it was before we started this week in FCPA, I think. So Weismann was the general counsel who agreed to be wired up and tried to get the president of the company to admit to bribery and corruption. The case went to trial. The president took the case to trial. Weismann pled out, and the president's name was Joseph Siegelman, and the judge really found Weismann to be a not credible witness. I think is probably as delicate and civil a way to put it as possible. And the prosecution of Siegelman collapsed based on that. So Weismann disbarred basically from the disbarred in 2 states and now banned in front of the SEC. Jay, we had a very interesting article by Matthew Stephenson, our colleague at Harvard, and he took a look at, or rather speculated on, what a Wal-Mart settlement looked like. And I guess the thing that intrigued me was a couple of points that he raised, Jay. One was really in his introduction. He said that he wrote this, I guess last week, but maybe even earlier, and he was posting it while he was traveling, and he would not be able to update the story while he was traveling. And it's what intrigued me was that he must think that this case is literally on the settlement doorstep for him to say something like that. Now, we've heard wind of a potential settlement in the range of $300 million, perhaps less, perhaps a monitor, perhaps not. And so I was very intrigued. That I wonder what would cause him to think that the settlement is really at the door to be signed. But he took a look at it. It was very interesting speculation, and he admitted it was speculation. So we're going to have to see what the settlement has. Was there anything in there that really struck you, Jay, one way or the other?
I think what's interesting is he kind of broke his analysis into 2 different camps. And there's one camp which, is the folks who feel that the time is ripe for FCPA reform. And that would be kind of like the group from the Chamber of Commerce several years ago, led by Mike McCaskey, and how they came forward with wanting to have a compliance defense. And then we have the camp where I think you and I fit in quite firmly, that the FCPA is A-OK. And then there is an extreme version of that camp that feels that the government and the regulations don't go far enough in terms of enforcing penalties and deterrence against those people who violate. So I think it's a pretty balanced discussion on either end. And with that, number being put out there of 300 million, there is a way to have each side come up okay, saying that, the company that, originally they were supposedly looking at $1 billion fine, then there was a 600 million number put up towards the end of last year. And to settle at 300 million sounds like it's a lot of money, but it's probably a pretty good result. So from that side, the FCPA reform side would say that, things worked out. The company had additional leverage. They could go back and negotiate in the government. And this is the number they came up with. The con on that is that they might end up spending 3 times that penalty in terms of investigative costs and improved ethics and compliance. So that's the FCPA reform side. And on the FCPA A-OK side is that a process was run. They came out with a settlement that fit the crime or fit the alleged activity, and then they moved forward. So I too share the interest in what would make Matt get this article out there and think that there's going to be an imminent settlement. So from what we've seen so far from an FCPA perspective, both from DOJ and SEC, there really has not been a lot to write about here in Q1 and Q2. So, maybe something's going to happen in June, right as school's getting out. We'll have to see.
Perhaps so. Jay, one other thing, we may have touched on this earlier last week, but I just wanted to bring it up again this week because several commentators outside of the compliance space wrote about this, and it's the federal judge who sentenced Samuel Mebiame, the bagman for Och-Ziff. We talked about his sentencing, as reported by Sam Rubenfeld, but what we didn't talk about was the judge's criticism of the Department of Justice. And the judge was very direct. If you've ever been in front of a federal judge, you know, those guys are pretty circumspect. And when they say something directly, you know they mean it. And he was, I thought, highly critical of the department for bringing one individual prosecution. He asked the Department of Justice prosecutor why there weren't additional charges brought by others. And the prosecutor, put on the spot, said, well, we're working on that, Judge. So I think the federal judiciary is beginning to raise concerns about deferred prosecution agreements, non-prosecution agreements, and really just the lack of individual prosecutions. So where that goes, we'll just have to see. Does that tie into any of the points you raised about the inertia starting to set in? Does that cause investigations not to shorten in time, but lengthen in time, frankly, because the DOJ doesn't have the resources, because people aren't, the new administration's not appointing persons to fill these slots. Where that all works into this calculus, I don't know. But nevertheless, when you have a federal judge articulating that kind of criticism, the wider media picked it up, and I think that shows its real true significance going forward.
Well, I just had an image of the first time we actually met, if you recall. It was the Mayflower Hotel, and I believe you were there with Volkov, and each of you had your wives with you. And not only was it Compliance Week, but I think you were there for, was it the Sure Shot trials? Does that sound right?
Yeah.
So that's got to be what? Is that 6 years ago already?
I think you're right, 2012.
Yeah. So, there has been a lot of people have spoken about the fact that, there's actually a dearth of any case law that's really happened with regard to FCPA prosecutions, either from a DOJ or an SEC perspective. So with everybody wanting to get dragged in front of the court and willing to tell their side of the story, maybe that might be something that could happen in the second part of this year, that maybe we start to get some case law, because if we look at what just happened with the Supreme Court and taking a look at disgorgements, there's still a lot of the mechanism with completing FCPA, situations that it's still being done by DPAs and NPAs, and now we've got the pilot program. So maybe things might shift on the other end, and we might see some court activity by the end of the year.
So the do you have a weekend report preview for us, Jay?
Well, I was going to go faux, but now that's been a little bit messed up for me. So I think there's been a lot of response on LinkedIn, and a lot of people have been very kind to take a look at my blog from last week, which you suggested, which is using compliance as a competitive advantage. So I thought what I would do is kind of take some of the feedback that I got from that and work that into a follow-on article. But I definitely have heard from people all over the world and many different industries, really starting to think about, how is that something that they could bring to bear in their own, corporate situations. So that's what the weekend read's looking like right now.
Excellent.
One question for you in the Wall Street Journal article. Did we want to talk about the quotes from either one of the mics?
You bet. Go ahead.
So, you pick the first mic, and I'll pick the second one.
No, you take them both.
All right. Well, we have our good friend Mike Volkov, who said that, he's been saying the same thing for years. And what the same thing is in terms of, wanting to have more individual accountability. So Volkov said that federal judges are increasingly tired of being viewed as rubber stamps to questionable prosecutorial decisions made by the Justice Department when dealing with criminal liability. The judges' complaints are significant and may trigger more concerns from the federal bench as the Justice Department relies on TPAs and NPAs and limited individual prosecutions, especially in light of the Yates memo. And actually kind of being on the same page, Mike Kaler, the FPA professor, said that he would say kudos to the judge based on the reported remarks. So they both seem to be on the same page here, and that kind of echoes what I was just talking about before, that, without having this individual liability there seems to be, they don't really seem to be getting to the root cause and to the people who are responsible for what's happening. So, as we said, it'll be interesting to see if this gains any momentum, especially with this, with the comments by the judge.
So, Jay, I wanted to spend just a few minutes talking about Hui Chen and what I think she has meant to the compliance profession. I recognize that her social media postings, Twitter comments, remarks to journalists have been somewhat controversial. Nevertheless, I think for the compliance profession and for the compliance professional, the mark of Hui Chen has been deep, it has been wide, it has been dramatic, and frankly, it's a mark that we all should applaud. She really took the role of the chief compliance officer and put it squarely into the calculus of fines and penalties under the FCPA. And she did that in a way that brought the chief compliance officer into the discussions regarding a fine and penalty, regarding a settlement, regarding even decisions to bring charges. And it was her input and her insights that really, I think, brought the compliance chief compliance officer position and the compliance profession, elevating that into that discussion. Now, that does not mean that discussion was not happening before, but it was largely happening through outside counsel. And outside counsel would meet with the Department of Justice, and they would go through various machinations, fines, penalties, ranges, settlement negotiations. But the outside counsel are not compliance practitioners day-to-day, chief compliance officers or compliance professionals who know that the nuts and bolts of compliance. And by bringing the nuts and bolts of compliance into the discussion, I think it elevated not only the importance of our profession, but it also elevated, Jay, the importance of the compliance program. And that may be our greatest lasting legacy, that the compliance program itself has become important. Once again, certainly the Department of Justice since 1999, with Metcalf and Eddy through 2004, then again in 2008, put out information on best practices compliance programs. We've obviously had the 2012 FCPA guidance and the 10 hallmarks of an effective compliance program, leading up to the February 2017 evaluation of corporate compliance programs document. But Hui Chen, in the short 2 years or less than 2 years she's been with the department, has made the chief compliance officer, has made the compliance profession, and has made compliance programs more front and center to the discussions around enforcement. And I think the profession really owes her a tip of the hat for doing that. She's led a discussion around CCO compensation. She's led a discussion around resources to the compliance department and the compliance function of a company. She initially gave us some metrics back in November and December 2015 that she was going to utilize for compliance programs going forward to April 2016 with the FCPA pilot program. There were 3 prongs that the Department of Justice said it would consider to give a reduction in fine or penalty, self-disclosure, extensive cooperation, and then extensive remediation. And the extensive remediation really gave the compliance practitioner a very good guide of topics to self-benchmark your own compliance program. And then finally, the 2017 evaluation of corporate compliance documents, 11 prongs of inquiry with 44 separate questions, I believe, that compliance officers can ask themselves and of their own program and of their own senior management to help them operationalize compliance. So obviously, she worked in conjunction with the Department of Justice. She worked with Patrick Stokes while he was there. She worked with Dan Kahn, who is currently the head of unit. Andrew Weissman's been there the entire time. So it's obviously a team and collaborative effort. Yet Hui Chen really, I think, if not specifically leading that effort, was a big part of that effort. And she's really brought our profession and the compliance programs to a greater prominence at that role, or excuse me, at that level. And then now with the 2017 evaluation document, we're looking at operationalizing compliance, really showing that it's a business process, memorializing what Roy Snell says has been going on in a discussion in his with his groups for 20 years. So now we have the Department of Justice representative or the Department of Justice itself kind of embracing the discussion that senior compliance professional leaders have been having for many years about the business process of compliance. So I just wanted to really think about and give a kudos to Hui Chen for what she has meant to our profession, what she has meant to compliance programs. And I hope that the department obviously is going to at least consider another candidate. As I said, you can apply for this by clicking through our show notes today. And I hope that we continue to have this kind of communication and, more importantly, dialogue with the Department of Justice about what a best practices compliance program is, what their thoughts on what should exist, and operationalizing compliance.
I don't think I could have said it any better myself, Tom. It just kind of reminds me of this old cigarette ad from, I think, the 70s for Virginia Slims, and it says, "You've come a long way, baby." And I recall many times when we would look at an FCPA case, and it would always be about, looking at the opinion release and trying to get little breadcrumbs from the DOJ on, what was important in this case and what mattered. And, as we look back over the last 2 years, there's been a real codification of what is important, and going from, the guidance that was released about 5 years ago to the latest evaluation. We've said several times that if you're a CCO out there and you aren't asking these questions about a type of industry you're in, or type of business that you do, or a geographic area where you conduct business, there's really no excuse for you missing the boat. So, kudos to Hui Chen for bringing that order, for really doing a service by bringing transparency to what the DOJ is looking for from the compliance function and involving the CCO in that discussion.
So, Jay, I need to continue to talk about my new book, 2016, The Year in Corporate Compliance, Corporate FCPA Enforcement, rather. Once again, I've linked to it in the show notes. It's the only book that reviews the 2016 FCPA year in enforcement, the greatest year in FCPA enforcement history ever. I talk about the cases. I talk about the lessons you can draw and learn from the cases. And I talk about the commentary by government officials, both from the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Department of Justice, about where they see compliance and enforcement going forward. So if you're interested in that at all, please check out the book. It's available through Compliance Week's publishing, Sister Arc Publishing, but the link's on today's show notes. So, Jay, with that, you want to take us home?
Sure. So, on behalf of my colleague and cohort, Tom Fox, the compliance evangelist, this is Jay Rosen, Mr. Monitor, and we thank you for joining us to take a look at This Week in FCPA for the week ending June 9th, 2017.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you again for listening. to This Week in FCPA. If you have enjoyed this episode and you've listened to it on iTunes, I would greatly appreciate it if you would rate us. It would help us in our rankings and also help us get the word out about the only weekly report on FCPA and compliance-related events. Also, Jay and I would love to hear from you. You can reach Jay at jrosen@affiliatedmonitors.com. I'm, of course, at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. This is Tom Fox. Thank you very much for joining us, and we're going to have a special belated 50th anniversary episode next week, so I hope you will join us for the festivities. Thank you again for listening.